These are the Addams Family Chronicles. Chapter 38, Gerald Ford. Cars say a lot about who we are, or at least we think they do, when truly, the only real function they serve is to get us from point A to point B. Sometimes we enjoy them, and other times we despise them. Some go fast, while others don't go at all. The Addams family owned several, but the subject of this story is one 1971 Ford LTD, affectionately known to them as Gerald Ford. Gerald was purchased secondhand in 1975. It had 104,000 miles on it when Mom bought it. It was gray, with a black vinyl top and a maroon interior, and seated six very comfortably. Mom probably thought she didn't need it when she bought it, even though the green 1962 Chevy 2 she had been driving barely ran and appeared to have been involved in a demolition derby. She had been involved in an accident in that Chevy the prior summer with a state senator named Jim Lane from Idabel. He had run a red light at a busy intersection in Duncan, leaving the driver's side door caved in and unusable. It was suspected that Senator Lane had been drinking before the accident, though he wasn't ticketed, nor did he pay the damage to Mom's car. The damage sustained in this accident forced her and her passengers to enter and exit the car from the passenger side. And while awkward at first, the family became so accustomed to this ritual that it didn't seem strange at all. Still, sometimes it caused embarrassment to the Addams children when they were dropped off at school, when friends took notice of the hoopty in which they arrived. So imagine the joy of getting a new family car, one which held status as a luxury car, even if it was already 4 years old. Yes, Gerald was accepted quickly. He didn't get the best of gas mileage, but in the mid-70s, gas was less than 50 cents a gallon. He came equipped with a 400 cubic inch engine, offering good power when the pedal was pressed to the floor, though Mom never tested it. She didn't care about Gerald's power. She was more impressed with the roominess and the smooth ride that allowed for leisurely motoring to and from work every day. Other drivers who met her on city streets might have wondered if the car was driving itself, due to the size of the car in relation to its driver. This, along with the pace of her driving, recalled a scene reminiscent of a grandma headed to church on Sunday morning, with her head barely visible above the steering wheel. Gerald served her well for the 3 years she owned him, and he was pampered and happy. Then things got dicey when young Eric started driving. Gerald was there for young Eric's driving test when he turned 16. And Mom was generous with her trust by offering to allow Eric to take Gerald on mostly unsupervised dates with his girlfriend. This offered Eric a lot of undeserved freedom in his activities, and within 3 months of gaining his learner's permit, Eric drove him straight into a telephone pole, injuring poor Gerald's back passenger side quarter panel. It was a lengthy rehab for Gerald, but after a trip to the body shop, he recovered nicely. Soon, Eric resumed his dating activities with Mom's blessings, and on a cold night in January, Eric lost his virginity, right there in Gerald's back seat. Indeed, Gerald was multifunctional. But as luck would have it, fate had other plans for Gerald. There was a new owner in his future. Keith had a 1959 Plymouth Savoy known to the Addams family as Jaws. It was a fine car in its own right, and it served Keith well as he attended college in the big city. But on a cold, icy road in Midwest City, Jaws' life ended in a 3-car pileup underneath an I-40 underpass. Mom gave the beloved Gerald to him and purchased a brand new Honda Civic she called R2D2. This was during the oil crisis of early 1979, and she was intrigued by the gas mileage that her son, Lynn, had enjoyed, having purchased his own Honda CVCC the year before. She had forsaken Gerald for another car, but Gerald still had a lot of life left in him. Keith owned Gerald for almost 2 years, and during this time, Gerald was a bit neglected. He didn't get the usual car washes or oil changes to which he'd been accustomed when he was in the custody of his previous owner. This was not by choice, but rather necessity, as Keith could barely afford to take care of himself, much less his car. In the 2 years he was with Keith, his paint faded a bit, and his filters got dirty, but he continued his duties without complaining much. His purpose was to serve, not to be served. But he had no idea of what true hardship and neglect awaited him in the years that followed. Gerald was passed down to Eric in 1980. Eric's car had cracked its block due to a myriad of circumstances, probably from abuse by its owner. Eric was a hard master when it came to cars. He had no idea of the mechanics of a car. He only knew he liked to drive them, and drive them hard. Gerald endured another 2 years of maltreatment, suffering through long periods of absent maintenance and harsh driving conditions. He did get a new stereo system to help him enjoy these hard times, but his shock absorbers and brake pads were in bad shape, causing him to labor and moan when called upon to do his work. He was approaching old age, and still, the worst was yet to come. Alicia took over ownership of this once proud Land Cruiser when Eric was given a Monte Carlo, and one can only assume that Gerald was relieved by the change in his custody. However, she was barely 17 and a junior in high school, and her life was about socializing and partying. Gerald was taken to places he had never before seen, like desolate landscapes and washed-out lake roads, and he was often asked to haul around 6 or 7 drunk or stoned high school kids who puked on his floor mats and burned holes in his upholstery with their cigarettes. It was during this dark period that he reached 200,000 miles, still limping along in service to the Adams household. But his darkest time still lay ahead of him. Another car came along for Alicia, a 1980 Chrysler. It was nice and barely used, and she drove it now, leaving Gerald parked in the street in front of the house on Harmony Lane. An advertisement was placed in the local newspaper that read, "For sale by owner, 1971 Ford LTD, 208,000 miles, $200. OBO. Answers to the name of Gerald." The calls came quickly from interested buyers, so quickly that when the first 2 parties that came to look, they arrived simultaneously, and a bidding war for Gerald ensued. The winning bidder paid Alicia $250, and the loser called foul and threatened to call the authorities. But Alicia stood her ground and pointed out that the ad had said, "or best offer." The young man who'd bought Gerald was given the keys, and after he started the car, Gerald creaked away from the curb and down the street, leaving behind him a thick trail of oil and fond memories. Gerald built his legacy around a family that loved him. He traveled more in service to the Adams family than any car they had ever owned, and he left miles of memories behind. His was a hard life, but a long and happy one too. And somewhere in a salvage yard in southern Oklahoma, he sits, alone and abandoned, rusting more and more with every thunderstorm that comes along. But the memories of those times still glisten, like raindrops that once beaded on his polished hood, and the family remains forever grateful. Chapter 39. Keep your eyes on the road. There's a red-letter date in the life of one of the Adams children, January 29th, 1977. It was a date that affected the way he would view social responsibility for the rest of his life. Morally immature and financially naive, this is the story of a young man's abrupt passage from capricious unawareness to clear understanding. It was a night like any other Saturday night. The news was that Freddie Prinze, star of Chico and the Man, had died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He was 22. The news held little meaning to most high school kids, however, other than the senselessness of the whole thing. Most kids of that age were more concerned with their social calendar. And so it was for young Eric, almost 16, and looking forward to his date that night. Mom was out of town for the weekend with her boyfriend, and although it was out of character for her at the time, she had consented to allowing Eric to use her car this particular evening. Of course, it was expected that he not break the law by driving unaccompanied without a licensed driver. His girlfriend was already 16, but Eric only had a learner's permit. The ritual on previous date nights was for Eric to drive with his mother across town to pick up his date, then drive back across town to deliver Mom at home again before the date could even commence. This process was repeated at the end of the night. Mom was always one to teach her children to live by rules, and she never wavered in enforcing them. So, because Mom was out of town, Keith had consented to performing Mom's duties in this regard, and the problem of any moving violations being incurred was solved. The night was about to get interesting. The car sped away from 920 Maxwell Street, the excited couple waving to Keith as he disappeared back into the house. There were no exact plans for the night, other than driving around Grand Avenue, which was the main drag for many high school students. And on their first loop around, they saw one of their friends, Mike Chastain. He was a senior. He drove a 1976 Plymouth Roadrunner and was known for the sort of risky behavior that drove his friend's parents crazy. Eric pulled up beside his car and parked on the drag. "Hey, Mike." His greeting caught Mike in the middle of a big swig from a tall boy Coors. As he lowered the can from his lips, he looked over and smiled calmly, sitting alone behind the wheel of his Roadrunner. Strains of "New Kid in Town" blared from speakers mounted in the rear window. "Want a beer?" The young couple looked at each other, as if waiting to see which of them would be the first to say yes or no. Eric took the lead enthusiastically. "Sure." Mike handed them each an ice-cold tall boy, as the next track on the tape, "Life in the Fast Lane," crackled through the speakers. It was vintage Joe Walsh, ripping through the intro, a harbinger of events to come. Eric peeled back the tab on his beer and tipped it up between paranoid glances, shuddering at the bitter taste of the first swallow as it went down. A nasal burp followed, bringing tears to his eyes. "Coors is my favorite beer." Mike laughed knowingly at Eric's statement. In truth, Eric had only drank alcohol once before, on a Thanksgiving trip with his older brothers to see his father in 1974. "Well, here then, have the rest of the six-pack." Mike handed the other 3 cans in the carton through the window to the waiting hands of the teenagers. The complexion of the night was now taking on a different perspective altogether. "Thanks, you're my hero. Take it easy." Eric started up the car and pulled out of the parking lot onto Grand Avenue, watchful for police cars. He figured the best thing would be to get out of town, away from activity, so as not to draw attention to themselves. So the next couple of hours were spent driving around the lake, away from the masses, drinking the gift that had been bestowed on them. Their moods were high as they drove back into town around 9:45, conscious of the fact that they had to be home by 10:30. The effects of the alcohol were now coursing through their bodies, and his date had become amorous, sitting in the middle of the bench seat next to him, underneath his arm that was draped around her body. She reached over to kiss his neck without inhibition, prompting Eric to reciprocate by taking his eyes from the road and planting a wet kiss squarely on her mouth. As he glanced back to the road, the tender scene turned to chaos. He was off the pavement, heading directly for a telephone pole. It was too late for critical thought, only reaction to the moment. He pulled the wheel hard left, sending the car into a long skid on the grass before impacting the pole against the back passenger side quarter panel with a sudden crunch. The engine stalled, and a sobering silence descended upon them. They looked at one another without saying a word, but what passed between them spoke volumes. Eric's shaking hand turned the key to restart the motor, and after several cranks, it started. He pulled away from the pole, wincing at the sound of the wheels scraping the body with every revolution it made. He turned the last corner and maneuvered into the driveway at 920 Maxwell Street before cutting off the engine. As the two of them surveyed the damage, Keith joined the inspection. He said nothing, perhaps because there was nothing really to say. A phone call was made, and a friend came to pick up Eric's date to take her home, leaving Eric to explain what had happened. And as Eric and his brother turned to head inside for the evening, snow began to fall. What in the world would he tell Mom? Sunday morning came, and many of his friends had heard the news of what had happened. They came over to look at the damage and hear Eric's side firsthand. He didn't offer them much hospitality, but was thankful for their presence at such a stressful time. They all proposed storylines that could be rendered to Mom, but somehow none of them seemed to work too well. And in the midst of the vigil, Alicia came in with a sack full of pieces from Mom's car that she had collected at the crash site. It was a welcome bit of levity to break the gloom, though it was short-lived. Mom would be coming home soon. At around 6 o'clock that evening, Eric heard car doors shut outside. It was time for Lies to start. When they walked in, their stern faces announced that any sort of evasive language would not be well received. So, he decided to tell the truth. Sort of. Mom, here's what happened. We went out last night and we were driving home. She was sitting next to me and I had my arm around her. I reached over to kiss her, momentarily taking my eyes off the road. And when I looked up, all I saw was a telephone pole in my way. I swerved to miss it, but the back end slid right into the pole. I'm sorry, Mom. Well, I have insurance, but you'll have to pay the deductible. It's $100. Mom was receptive to the explanation that Eric had offered, and in turn, he was accepting the terms that she had laid out for reimbursement. Nothing was ever mentioned about the role alcohol played in the accident. The opportunity for Eric to learn something from the experience might have died right then and there. In fact, Eric didn't even pay the $100 deductible. Keith did. It just so happened that Keith owed Eric $100 from a loan when Keith had moved back home after leaving college at OU. But from this, Eric would gain insight about money management and the importance of saving it for something unforeseen. To this day, Eric saves his money, fearful of another telephone pole lurking along life's highway. And as the years passed by, the story of the accident would be recounted time and time again. And each time it was told, Eric would remember how he had not been honest with his mother that day, and his guilt for having lied by omission would grow worse. Finally, after all those years, the truth has set him free.